Hi, I'm Jesse Mangan.
And I'm Rob Wipond, and this is Psych Force Report.
So, in a recent PsychForce report, you were writing about how people age 50 and older are the fastest growing demographic among the unhoused. Was that something that you were specifically looking for, that data specifically, or was that something that you stumbled on while looking at something else?
Yeah, I did kind of stumble upon it. I was doing some work in another area. I do some research and writing on community development, and there's this recognition that poverty is a real problem in older adults right now, people who are retiring, and that this is a huge demographic in our society right now. The sort of boom generation is getting into their 60s and 70s and 80s, and this is a massive population, and there's a lot of poverty there. And while I was researching that, I discovered that in fact it seemed we had a lot of data to suggest one of the biggest and fastest growing populations among the unhoused, homeless populations. And that really struck me because, as you know, we're looking at a situation where now across North America, it's frequently being blamed, homelessness is frequently being blamed on rising rates of untreated mental illness or on rising rates of substance use. And it's not that there aren't other kinds of problems affecting homelessness, but what really struck me here is this one was really not being talked about, and it was a very substantial proportion of homeless people.
Yeah, I think in the data you were citing, it in both BC and then in a survey in San Francisco, it looked like the rates over the past maybe 20 years had almost doubled. So the representation of people 50 or 55 and older in these unhoused populations being studied had almost doubled in about 20 years.
Yeah,
And
to fairly substantial large portions there. Sorry for interrupting you, but yeah, the you know up from 10% to over 21% in Vancouver, which is a place where there's a very large unhoused population in British Columbia. And then we found similar, more recent data in San Francisco and then California wide to suggest it was as many as 41%, 44%, I think California wide of the unhoused population was people over the age of 50 or 55. And so these numbers are huge. And then that is mirrored nationwide. So we had data from Margot Kushel, who's done a lot of that research across North America, pointing out that this was a trend we could see in cities, in urban centers with large homeless populations across North America.
I think that specificity in the data was something that struck me reading your report because when you see a rate so specific, like a demographic so specific, rise so much so quickly, like you start looking for alternative explanations. And I think maybe one of the reasons why someone might hear this statistic and not give it as much thought is a lot of media just sort of blasts us with the image of an unhoused person who is unhealthy and maybe older, and people get used to the idea without really thinking about what was the systemic factor that led to that. And there was some really interesting stuff in the data about I think what was it about 40% in the San Francisco survey, about 40% of the people who were 50 years of age or older had never been unhoused before, something like that.
Yeah, that's right. And that's a very important piece of this puzzle because naturally there would be a tendency to think, well, maybe that's just unhoused people who've been chronically unhoused for a long time getting older over the years, which of course would happen. But what this data is showing is that an enormously important percentage of these people are unhoused for the very first time. And so, yeah, and they don't have any of these issues. They're not substance users, they're not being labeled with mental illnesses, they're otherwise ordinary older people who, well, what is happening to them? What do we know? And that's what the data is actually pretty clear. We're seeing that pensions are not keeping up with the pace of the affordability of housing. And so, in a lot of cases, people are being priced out of their homes, whether it's a rental home or even a home that they own in some way, but they can no longer afford to stay there. For example, if they lose a partner and their pension isn't enough anymore to cover their overall cost of living, and or they get some sort of illness where their care needs may be a bit higher than they were before, and suddenly their whole financial situation is changing. So there's a lot of social isolation in this group as well, where they don't have the kind of support structures among family or elsewhere that they can fall back on. So, and it's important to highlight that what we're talking about here in a large case too would be just people who have worked all their lives. And in some cases, we have data showing that a large percentage still are working. They're just not earning enough. Minimum wage is not enough anymore to pay for an average kind of one bedroom or two bedroom apartment, even in a lot of these urban centers where this is occurring. And so elderly people are often simply ending up on the street, even when they're not retired yet. But when they're retired, we can just look at the numbers and realize that, okay, if you actually are dependent on the government pension that you've paid into, but you didn't maybe bank enough to have really robust private pension of some kind, then you could be in a lot of trouble.
And I mean, when you drill down just a little bit more, there is, I think in the San Francisco data, it was like 24 to 26% of the people who were surveyed who were unhoused were Black, and another 26% or something were Latinx. And so you have a ridiculously, exponentially disproportionate representation of people of color in this unhoused population. And when you talk about systemic factors, like in the US, we had a history of redlining and just a history of policies designed to destabilize certain communities. And you're seeing the legacy of that. And so I'm wondering, have you seen anything now happening now, any policies, any programs, any approaches that might be helping in some way to actually help people get back into stable housing?
Yeah, absolutely. And in this particular research that I was doing, I happened to be able to visit a place that was doing great work, and it bears out in the research as well. And we've known this for a long time. It's basically supportive housing. This is what people need at a certain point. I mean, obviously, there's an affordability issue there. So that has to be grappled with by governments. Governments have, by and large, across North America, diminished the level of support that they give to uh, producing subsidized housing, housing that's more affordable for people. Over the last few decades, it's been this consistent downturn in that area, and we definitely need to create more affordable housing overall. And then part and parcel with that is supports. Definitely, as people age, we become disabled in that sense. We are all, in that sense, disabled people waiting to be.
I think what you're identifying is the self-fulfilling prophecy of the stigmatized proclamation that people who are unhoused must have a mental health problem. And the self-fulfilling prophecy is that when you do not have stable housing, or when you do not have stable support, when you don't know where your next meal is coming from, the stress of that is going to have a health impact on anyone, no matter what your starting point is. When you do not have the necessary support to live, it is going to cause stress, which is going to affect your health. And people who are aging are at a higher risk of various sorts of like detrimental effects. And so when you take someone who's 50 or older, and that is the first time they experience being unhoused, it would be predictable that they are probably going to be at an increased risk of further effects from that destabilizing event.
Yeah. And thank you. And where I was leading to with that was just back to your original question around the importance of supports in that environment. And so there is lots of great models out there of providing different types of kind of more intensive or less intensive supports for people in their daily lives. So it could be something as simple as, hey, you're really not feeling well right now, there's somebody here who can actually go grocery shopping for you because you do still like to cook and that is a big part of your life, but you can't get out. So, okay, there's somebody here that can help with that. And they take the names and the lists of a variety of people on that whole floor of the building. And they go shopping and bring that back. Or it could be something more intensive where basically that same person is also brokering the connection between you and the healthcare system and making sure you get the kind of daily physical attention you may need from the healthcare system and find out if that's available for you. Are you going to have to be institutionalized in a long-term care facility, or can you continue to live in an independent environment closer to your friends and family where you've maybe already lived most of your life? And they can look into that and help you find those kinds of resources if they're available, or provide them if it's possible for them to provide them. So there's this whole range out there of types of supports that different types of organizations can offer. And if they get appropriate funding one way or another, whether that comes from philanthropic funders or from the government, it can make a huge difference to somebody's ability to stay in their own home for longer, have a higher quality of life than getting institutionalized or ending up homeless and therefore having all sorts of their problems, escalate and worsen while they're living on the street. And suddenly, we are labeling them as mentally ill, even though we probably created that problem by making them homeless to begin with. Or maybe they do take up a substance, again, because it's so hard living on the street.
It almost seems sometimes like we as a culture are obsessed with labeling and all of the stigma that comes with that. So an elderly person is easy to process as being unhoused because someone thinks that there must be a failure on their part. We see the just ridiculously exponentially disproportionate representation of people of color in the unhoused communities, and people don't seem to really directly be making the connection to the systemic failures that would lead certain demographics to be in this situation, this destabilizing situation. And so I wanted to ask you, do you have a sense of why the systems, the governments, the people running the show, so to speak, are so reluctant to actually do the things that would give people the support they need?
I think it's brutal to face. I think that's part of it. Like even me, right?
Mm.
Even those of us who really, you know, like are trying to see these issues in a different way as I'm walking down the street, it is hard to see a person. I mean, I saw this guy with no legs in a wheelchair living on the street, you know, and just to see that and to feel it, I think it's just really hard for us. And so then we want to almost kind of think it's not my fault. I'm in no way connected to this. No, it must be entirely his. He probably had a perfectly good pension and disability pension and supports, and he must have blown it somehow, right? Like it's easier for my mind in some way to go there, to slough it off than it is for me to go, how many more people are there like this, and how to blame am I, and what parts of me are to blame, and what aspects of the lifestyle I've lived are partly to blame, and all sorts of other things start cascading into my thinking as I'm realizing that this is almost certainly a systemic problem. And so then that runs into all of these issues, right? Then suddenly I'm like, yeah, in my community, how many people of color relative to how many people of color there would be relative to the population? I don't even know. Do I know in the particular city I'm living in right now? And what does that mean about me, right? and
Mm.
and we get into this, and I think that that's just a really difficult process to go through, and that's why we're not seeing appropriate media coverage of it, and we're not seeing appropriate policy discussion of it because it hits really harder closer to home. And it raises some big fundamental questions about, say, the economic system. So, for example, why do we not have something as simple as affordable housing right now? Why is there less of it and not more of it? Well, there are very clear examples, one of them being that private equity firms are getting into the rental housing market, that banks and banks have long liked to invest in that market too. But now we've got private equity firms with a real profit motive in the housing market. And how is that affecting things? And so we're going to have to regulate. We're going to have to change that in some way. And that could be a pretty fundamental change to how our economy works, because housing is a really fundamental part of our economy overall. So that becomes a very big structural issue that we have to grapple with, that raises all sorts of questions about capitalism and how it functions.
Something that I'm struck with as you were talking about how brutal it can be to see someone whose life you don't understand, who seems to be suffering and not know how to help. That's a really vulnerable, powerful feeling, and it's hard to really reconcile with that. But I think one of the things that is true throughout like the history of psychiatry is that psychiatry is a discipline that society goes to when it has a problem it doesn't know how to solve. And so when you have someone walking down the street and they see people who are suffering and they don't know what to do, they want to believe that someone somewhere has an answer. And the easiest answer to believe in is that there's someone who's going to help. So as long as that person disappears, you can believe that. That's what's being offered here. If we make these people disappear, you, the person who's uncomfortable, can believe that we solved it, that we helped them, when the reality is so much more complicated. And that's the sort of unspoken contract that society seeks for. And a lot of with a lot of medical disciplines, they want an easy answer that I don't know what to do, fix it for us. And the people who are uncomfortable, they want to be fed something that seems easy so that they don't have to think about it anymore. And disappearing the person is the easiest way to accomplish that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, involuntary commitment is one of the ways that people think they're doing something helpful,
Mhm.
and it often is not. And I think of something that simple too. I, as a naive Canadian with public health insurance, was in an American city one time, and an elderly man fell over off his
Mhm.
bicycle, and I was trying to help him, and he seemed, hurt at the time, in such that I thought I was doing something helpful by calling 911.
Mhm.
Well, by the time they showed up, I realized I had probably really not helped this guy. I mean, he was very, very drunk at the time and not quite good. So, it was hard for me to kind of really figure out what he needed or wanted anyhow. Nevertheless, I feel terrible about the fact that ultimately now, knowing what I know, that he probably got a huge ambulance cost charge. He probably got up to the hospital. They gave him a huge charge and probably just threw him back out on the street again. And now I know that this was a long time ago, and all of these things. But that's a great example. If you don't really know what's going to happen to someone when you're getting them help, be careful
Mhm.
about it. Like, if you're not willing to be the one that says, "Hey, what do you really need, and how can I right now help you?" and have that discussion.
As you're talking, one of the things I'm really reflecting on is the stress of living in unreliable systems. There is the potential just re-traumatization of another involuntary hospitalization, but also for purely medical things. If I have an accident, if something happens and someone calls 911 or an ambulance comes, those bills could destabilize me for years to come, or just could lead to me being unhoused, or to me being in the situation that we're talking about. And that fear, that stress is really difficult to navigate, which is why I appreciate these conversations and being aware of the trends and the topics and the systems, because I'm always planning for that worst case scenario.
I agree. I think that's one of the problems, one of the reasons why we as a society struggle to have these conversations, because it brings up a pretty profound fear, and that recognition that we are one accident away, one lost job away, one missed rental payment away from being homeless ourselves. And what does that really mean? And it can be frightening in a society that clearly does not have the kind of supports in place that we would want to have. And that's another reason that I think we want to think a lot about the role of involuntary commitment in all of this? Because is it something that you would want? Ask yourself that question, right? And you and I have an answer to that, but more broadly across society, I think everybody should ask that question. Do I want to be treated against my will when I'm expressly saying I do not want this? Is that something that I would welcome and want? And if not, then think about that, because yeah, it's a very, very traumatizing experience for other people to go through too. So be careful about um, projecting it onto others, or prescribing it for others.
Yeah, that's a really powerful thing to think about because it could happen to anyone. Thank you. And there will be more PsychForce Report conversations to come. So thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Jesse.
PsychForce Report. PsychForce Report. PsychForce.